I want you to picture a standard medical diagnosis. You know, if you break your arm, you get an X-ray.
Right.
You can see the fracture right there on the film. It's white on black. It's undeniable. Or if you have an infection, you get a blood test. You count the white blood cells. The evidence is objective. It's measurable. It exists outside of anyone's opinion.
It's raw data.
Mm.
It doesn't require interpretation in the same way, say, a regular conversation does.
Exactly. But when it comes to autism spectrum disorders, and specifically how we diagnose them, and maybe more importantly, how we understand the internal emotional life of autistic people, we aren't using X-rays. We don't have blood tests for that.
No, we don't.
We are effectively using the naked eye. We're watching behavior and making a judgment call.
Yeah, that is the reality. I mean, for decades, the entire diagnostics framework for autism has been built on what we call the deficit model.
The deficit model.
Right. A clinician sits in a room, watches a child or an adult for a set period, and essentially checks boxes based on what behaviors are missing.
Like a checklist of negatives.
Exactly. No eye contact, check. No social smile,
Yeah.
check. No apparent empathy, check. The operating assumption has literally always been, if I can't see it with my own eyes, it simply isn't there.
And that assumption that seeing is believing is exactly what we are dismantling today. We are looking at a really significant study published in 2025 in Frontiers in Psychiatry. This is by Elizabeth Torres and her team at Rutgers University.
It's a fascinating paper.
It really is. And they've done something that sounds a bit like science fiction. They basically used computer vision to prove that the naked eye is actually lying to us.
Yeah, it's a study that fundamentally challenges that deficit narrative. What Torres and her colleagues found is that the competencies, the emotions, the empathy, the profound desire to connect, they are absolutely present. They are actively firing in the nervous system.
But we don't see them.
Right, because they're happening on a frequency or a physical scale that human perception just naturally filters out.
So the mission for this deep dive is to explore this hidden language. We're going to break down how smartphone video and some very clever software revealed that the machinery for emotion is totally intact, even in individuals who have been labeled as, emotionless or non-responsive for their entire lives.
And to really grasp that, we have to start by accepting a pretty hard truth about ourselves. As human beings, we are actually terrible scientific instruments.
We really are. We think we see everything, but we miss so much.
We do. Which brings us to a concept the study references quite heavily, the perceptual umwelt.
Now, I love this term, but it is a bit of a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But it's a crucial biological concept. So umwelt basically translates to environment or surroundings.
Yeah.
But in biology, it refers to the self-centered sensory world of an organism.
The sensory bubble.
Exactly. Every creature lives in its own bubble. A bat experiences a world of echolocation. A tick experiences a world defined by temperature and the smell of sweat. And we humans, we only perceive a tiny, tiny slice of reality.
We see a specific spectrum of light, hear a specific range of sound.
Right. But it goes deeper than just light and sound. We also perceive time and movement in a very specific, rigid way.
We have a preset sampling rate, like a camera that only shoots 30 frames per second.
That is a perfect analogy. Neurotypical human interaction relies on a very tight, synchronized rhythm. If I smile at you, you expect that smile to happen at a certain speed, reach a certain peak intensity, and then dissolve at a certain rate.
Right.
If the movement is too fast, what we would call a micro movement, or if it's just too subtle, your brain literally doesn't register it as a smile, it registers it as nothing. Or maybe just as a twitch, just noise.
So if an autistic person is broadcasting an emotional signal, say a genuine smile or a look of surprise, but they are broadcasting it outside of my, outside my specific sensory bubble, I'm just going to completely miss it.
You won't just miss it, you'll misinterpret it. You'll label it as a lack of emotion. And that is exactly where the deficit model comes from. It's actually a failure of our perception, not necessarily a failure of their expression. The signal is being sent loud and clear, but the receiver is tuned to the wrong station.
That is a really heavy realization. It implies we have been looking at this wrong for, 50 years?
Easily.
So how did the researchers get around this? I assume if humans are the problem, we need to remove the human from the observation room.
That's exactly what they did. They swapped the human clinician for a digital lens. They recruited 126 participants. And this is a really robust, diverse mix. 56 individuals on the autism spectrum, ranging from those who are what we used to call Asperger's, all the way to those with high support needs, who are completely non-speaking.
And they just recorded them.
They just recorded them.
No massive MRI machines or, sticking electrodes all over people's heads.
No, and that's the real beauty of the methodology here. They used standard, everyday observational tools, cameras on iPhones, basic tablets, webcams, and the participants were recorded in these really brief 5-second bursts.
5 seconds.
They were asked to literally just sit there, and then they were prompted to make faces corresponding to 4 basic emotions: happy, angry, sad, and surprised.
But 5 seconds doesn't sound like enough time to catch anything meaningful. I mean, usually a clinical diagnosis takes hours.
To the naked eye, yeah, 5 seconds is a blink. But to a computer running open-face software, 5 seconds is an absolute eternity of data. This software places a digital grid over the face, tracking 68 distinct landmarks.
Like the corners of the lips, the eyebrows.
The jawline, the ridge of the nose, all of it. And it tracks them at a level of granularity that captures micro-movement spikes.
So we are talking about movements happening in milliseconds.
Correct. Because the software doesn't have an welt. It
Yeah.
doesn't get bored. It doesn't have social expectations about how a smile should look. And it doesn't filter out movements just because they're fast or small. It just records the raw objective motor data.
So let's look at what the machine actually saw. And I really want to start with the resting state.
Okay.
Because usually if someone is just sitting there doing nothing, we assume nothing is happening. If I'm looking at a non-speaking autistic child sitting in a chair, staring into space, I might think, okay, they're checked out, they're disengaged. But the data showed something very different, didn't it?
It did. And this is where we have to get just a little bit technical to understand the breakthrough. The researchers looked at the noise in the motor signals. Now, when we say noise here, we aren't talking about auditory sound.
Right.
We are talking about gamma noise, specifically the stochastic variability in the speed of the movement.
Okay, stochastic variability. Let's break that down for everyone.
Think of it like a heartbeat. A healthy heartbeat has a rhythm, but it's not a rigid metronome.
Oh.
There's a little natural variation. In motor control, noise is basically the jitter.
The jitter.
Yeah. Imagine you are trying to hold a laser pointer perfectly steady on a wall across the room. A neurotypical person might have a little bit of wobble. That's natural physiological noise. But the dot stays mostly in the center of the target.
Right, you can hold it mostly still.
What the researchers found in the autistic participants, even when they were just sitting entirely still, was that the dot was jumping around wildly. There was an incredibly high level of variability in the speed of their facial micro-movements.
So their nervous system is generating this absolute storm of motor signals, even when they aren't consciously trying to move a muscle.
Precisely. It's a state of high entropy, and this was the most pronounced in the participants with the highest support needs, specifically those who are non-speaking and have a diagnosis of apraxia.
Now, apraxia is usually described as a disconnect between motor planning and execution, right? Like you know what you want to do, but you just can't get the body to physically do it.
That's the classic textbook definition. But this study really adds a fascinating layer to it. It found that for this specific group, the noise in the lower face, the mandibular regions, the jaw, and the mouth was completely off the charts.
Man, what does that actually feel like for the person if your jaw and mouth are constantly generating this gamma noise?
Well, think about the cognitive load involved. If your baseline state, your supposed resting state, involves managing this chaotic storm of sensory feedback and tiny motor twitches that you have to constantly suppress or filter out your system, is under constant siege.
You aren't resting at all.
No, you are managing a massive flood of internal data.
It's like trying to have a relaxed conversation while standing next to a radio tuned to heavy static.
Yes.
It creates a high cognitive load just to exist.
And that completely reframes the outward behavior. If you see an autistic child with a blank stare, or who seems totally checked out, it is likely not disinterest, it's resource management. Their brain is working overtime just to maintain basic homeostasis against that internal noise.
Which totally explains the exhaustion, too. Why social interaction, which just adds more stimulus on top of all that baseline noise, leads to burnout so quickly. It's not that they don't want to socialize, it's that the bandwidth is already maxed out just by existing in their own body.
Exactly. It shifts the entire narrative from willfulness, they won't look at me, to capacity. They literally have their hands full. But here is where the study's pivot is so crucial. Despite all that noise, despite the static on the line, the researchers asked a vital question.
Is the signal still getting through?
Yes. When they are explicitly prompted to feel happy or surprised, does the face actually respond?
And this is the part that just completely destroys the stereotype. Because the stereotype says they don't feel it or they can't show it. I mean, if you look at the DSM-5 criteria, deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors is right there at the top of the list.
And the software proved that fundamentally wrong. It tracked what are called action units, or AUS. These are based on the facial action coding system developed by Paul Ekman. It's basically the gold standard for mapping specific facial muscles to specific emotions.
Right.
For example, action unit 6 is the cheek raiser. Action unit 12 is the lip corner puller.
So the ingredients of a smile.
The exact mechanical ingredients. And the study found that in the autistic participants, these action units did fire.
They fired.
They absolutely did. The muscles associated with happiness, anger, and surprise were actively engaging. The machinery of emotion is functional. The internal intent is there.
Okay, so the muscles are firing, the computer sees it happening. Why does the parent or the doctor in the room still see a flat effect? If the machinery works, why is the final product invisible to us?
It comes down to two primary things: intensity and dialect.
Okay.
First, let's look at intensity. The study found that while the muscles fired, the magnitude of the movement was often much, much lower than what is typically seen in neurotypical controls. It's a microexpression.
So it's a whisper instead of a shout.
Beautifully put. And because our neurotypical brains are strictly tuned to hear shouts, we expect these big, broad, obvious smiles. We miss the whisper completely. But the second factor, dialect, is even more fascinating to me.
The hidden language.
Yes. The autistic participants weren't just using the muscles less, they were using them differently. They were engaging entirely different combinations of muscles to express the exact same emotion.
Let's really drill down into this. What does autistic happiness look like to the algorithm compared to, say, neurotypical happiness?
Well, in the neurotypical control group, happiness is incredibly standardized. It's action units 6 and 12. High-intensity cheek raiser. Lip corners go up. It's the classic Hollywood smile.
Right, the standard grin.
In the autistic group, they did use the cheek raiser, but with much lower intensity. But, and this is the key, they also consistently engaged the brow lower.
The brow lower, but usually we associate lowered brows with anger or deep concentration.
Exactly. So imagine you are a parent, you look at your child, you just gave them a toy they love, and you're waiting for that big Hollywood smile. Instead, you see a very subtle cheek movement and a lowered furrowed brow.
Your brain does not compute joy.
It doesn't. Your neurotypical brain might compute confusion or discomfort or even anger. You misread the signal entirely because you don't speak the dialect.
It's a translation error. The internal intent is, I am so happy, but the output code is different. And because we judge their output based on our own neurotypical codebook, we get it completely wrong.
And we saw this across the board in the data. Look at the surprise prompt. When you are surprised, what is the cliche expected physical reaction?
Jaw on the floor, the jaw drop.
That is the standard neurotypical signal. But the autistic participants largely did not show the jaw drop. Instead, they consistently used the chin raiser.
Wait, they used the chin raiser for surprise.
Exactly. They lifted the chin up.
Instead of dropping the jaw.
Right. It's a distinct, consistent motor response. But again, if you are a clinician using the standard ADAS diagnostic checklist, and the checklist explicitly says look for jaw drop,
And you don't see it.
you mark them as having a deficit. You tick the box that says no reaction to surprise.
You mark them as broken when really they just have a different motor signature.
We are essentially penalizing them for not adhering to our very specific motor standards. The study calls this a mismatch in sensory motor expectancies. We firmly expect the face to do X. When it does Y, we just assume the system is broken.
This makes me wonder about the anger results. Was that also a different dialect? Because I feel like anger is usually much easier to spot.
Anger was really interesting because it was actually more intense in some very specific ways. Both groups lowered their brows. That seems to be a pretty universal human baseline for anger. But the autistic participants lowered them with significantly higher intensity.
Interesting.
And they also engaged the inner brow raiser, the muscle, right in the center of the forehead, much, much more than the neurotypical group did.
So it's a hyper-intense brow furrow.
Yes. And think about how that might be interpreted in the real world. If a neurotypical person gives you a subtle frown, you think, okay, they're annoyed. If an autistic person gives you this hyper-intense brow glare, you might read it as aggression or an impending meltdown.
Even if the internal feeling is just standard mild annoyance.
Exactly. The mismatch works both ways. We either entirely miss the signal because it's too small, or we drastically overestimate it because it's too intense for our expectations.
This brings us to a part of the study that I honestly found incredibly moving. but also scientifically baffling at first glance. The researchers didn't just look at the autistic individuals, they also scanned the faces of the parents, specifically the parents of the non-speaking, high-support participants.
This is the parent connection. And honestly, I think it's arguably the most profound finding in the entire paper. They wanted to see if there was a genetic component to these unique facial patterns. So they mapped the parents' micro movements. They looked at that gamma noise, the speed, the skewness of their expressions.
Now, logic dictates that these parents, who are neurotypical adults, should look mathematically like all the other neurotypical adults in the study. Like if you plot them on a scatter graph, they should cluster right there with their age group.
They absolutely should. If motor control is strictly about age and baseline neurology, they should be right in the middle of the neurotypical cluster.
But they weren't.
They weren't. No. When the researchers plotted the data, the parents' facial signatures were mathematically closer to their children's signatures than to the other neurotypical adult.
Wait, so the parents' faces had actually changed their movement patterns over time. They weren't moving like standard neurotypicals anymore.
They had drifted. Their signatures drifted toward their kids. The study posits two main theories for this. One is genetics. Maybe there is a shared underlying hereditary trait in how their nervous systems manage motor noise, which is entirely plausible.
Sure.
But the second theory, and the one the researchers really seem to lead into, is motor mimicry.
Which is essentially a physiological form of empathy, right?
It's deep, profound physiological empathy. I mean, we all do this to some extent. We unconsciously mirror the people we love. We adopt their slang. We mirror their posture when we talk to them. But these parents, over years of trying to deeply connect with their non-speaking children, may have unconsciously retuned their own facial micro-movements.
That is amazing.
They dampened their intensity. They adjusted their speed. They quite literally learned to broadcast on their child's unique frequency.
That completely flips the script on the whole lack of connection idea. I mean, society's constantly told that autistic kids, especially the non-speakers, live in their own little world and just can't connect with us.
Right.
But if the parents are physically adapting their nervous systems to match their kids, there is a massive, profound connection happening. It's just happening entirely beneath the surface of what the naked eye can see.
It heavily suggests that the gap between neurotypical and neurodiverse isn't unbridgeable at all. These parents bridged it. They didn't force their children to act normal. They entirely unconsciously moved toward their children's world. They co-adapted.
Co-adapted. So if we accept the findings of the study that the emotions are absolutely there, that the noise is just a different operating system, and that real connection is possible, what do we actually do with diagnosis? Because we can't just keep using subjective clinical checklists from the 1990s if we now know they're missing half the picture.
The study strongly argues for a fundamental shift from observation to quantification. We have to stop relying on the subjective naked eye. We have the technology now, this digital lens, to see the micro-movements clearly. We should be actively using it to augment clinical diagnosis.
So a doctor could literally have an iPad running this software during a session, and it would tell them, hey, you missed it with your eyes, but he just smiled at you.
Exactly. It acts as an objective translator. It validates that the person is engaging, even if the clinician doesn't feel it intuitively in their own Innswelt. That prevents misdiagnosis.
Yeah.
And more importantly, it prevents the absolute tragedy of assuming a child is locked in or intellectually disabled simply because their motor output is noisy.
It separates the motor capacity from the mental capacity.
Precisely.
And what about for the autistic individuals themselves? Is there a practical use for this technology beyond just getting a more accurate medical label?
There is huge potential for biofeedback therapies. Think about that apraxia disconnection we discussed earlier. The person wants to smile, they feel the joy, but they literally don't know if their face is doing it right because of all that overwhelming sensory noise.
They can't feel their own output clearly.
Right. But if we can show them a highly accurate visualization of their own micro-movements in real time on a screen, we give them motor autonomy.
We basically give them the dashboard for their own face.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of a therapist sitting there saying, smile bigger, look me in the eye, which is top-down pressure and causes immense stress.
Right, it's exhausting.
We allow them to explore their own unique motor system from the bottom up. They can see, oh, when I feel this internal emotion, the screen shows that my muscles are doing this. It's empowering rather than corrective.
It moves away from masking, forcing yourself to look rigidly neurotypical, which we know is incredibly harmful, to that concept of co-adapting.
Co-adapting is really the key term here. It fully acknowledges that both sides need to move. The autistic person can learn to navigate their motor system using these digital tools, sure. But we, the neurotypical world, we really need to learn to see the signals that are already broadcasting. We need to intentionally widen our umwelt.
It really seems like we are on the verge of a much broader realization here. Because if we have been missing these fundamental signals for so long, what else are we missing?
That is exactly the question I've been left with since reading this. The study definitely hints at this. As we start using this tech and seeing these new combinations of facial movements like the chin raise for surprise or the brow lower with a smile, we might realize that our current vocabulary for human emotion is just way too small.
We have words for happy, sad, angry, but maybe those words are just the neurotypical primary colors, like just red, blue, and yellow.
Exactly. Maybe that autistic surprise, that subtle chin raiser, isn't just a failed attempt at a neurotypical jaw drop. Maybe it genuinely carries a different, nuanced shade of emotional meaning that we literally don't have a word for yet.
Yeah.
We might be looking at a diversified emotional spectrum that is far richer and more complex than the simple binary of normal versus disordered.
A diversified humanity. I think that is the perfect place to land today. It suggests we aren't dealing with a broken version of us, but just a different, equally rich variation of human.
A variation that we are only finally building the right tools to understand.
This deep dive really challenges us to look closer, to not just trust our first glance, because 90% of the iceberg and 90% of the humanity in front of us is so often hiding just beneath the waterline.
We really just need the right lens to see it.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this. It's dense material. Stochastic signatures and action units, but it feels incredibly important to get the mechanics right.
My pleasure. It's exactly the kind of science that forces you to be a better, more empathetic observer.
And to you, listening, next time you interact with someone whose reactions don't perfectly match your expectations, take a beat. Remember the sampling rate. Remember the hidden language. You might be missing the most important part of the conversation.